The Neumann microphones hung silent in Studio 3 at Sunset Sound. It was 11:47 p.m. on September 15th, 1985, and the air conditioning hummed with the particular frequency that recording engineers learned to filter out of their consciousness. 43 people sat in the dimly lit control room and live area, nursing drinks that had gone warm an hour ago, watching Prince Rogers Nelson tune a white Stratocaster with the methodical precision of a Swiss watchmaker. The studio felt heavy with unspoken tension. This was hallowed ground in the music industry, the same room where Led Zeppelin had recorded Stairway to Heaven, where the Doors had crafted their psychedelic masterpieces. Tonight, it hosted an exclusive gathering of Warner Bros.' most valuable assets, but the usual industry small talk had died away the moment Prince picked up that guitar. This wasn't supposed to happen tonight. Warner Brothers had organized what they called a creative showcase for their elite artists and producers. A chance for musical cross-pollination, they said. Prince had flown in from Minneapolis specifically for this gathering, though nobody was quite sure why. He'd spent the first 2 hours listening to presentations from new acts, nodding politely, saying little. Then he'd asked if anyone minded if he played something. Eddie Van Halen sat in the back corner of the control room, partially hidden behind the SSL console. He'd arrived late, still wearing the leather jacket from his dinner meeting with his new manager. The meeting hadn't gone well. 3 months since David Lee Roth had quit Van Halen, and Eddie was still trying to figure out who he was without the frontman who'd made him famous. The music press was calling it the end of an era. Some were calling it the end of Eddie Van Halen. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him like a physical force. Record executives were already whispering about whether Van Halen could survive without Roth's theatrical presence. Eddie had spent the last week in his home studio, staring at half-finished songs that felt incomplete without a voice to carry them. The silence in his creative process had become deafening. Prince finished tuning and looked up at the small crowd. His eyes, outlined with subtle eyeliner, scanned the room until they found Eddie. "I hear we have guitar royalty in the building tonight," Prince said, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of Minneapolis and cosmic consciousness that had become his trademark. The great Eddie Van Halen. Eddie felt his stomach drop. He'd come tonight to observe, not to perform, not to be put on the spot by someone who just turned 27 and was already being called a genius by people who mattered. "Just listening tonight, Prince," Eddie said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Enjoying the show." Prince smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "That's a shame. I was hoping to finally hear what all the fuss is about." The room went quiet. Everyone understood they were witnessing the opening moves of something that could go very wrong, very quickly. Prince had a reputation for challenging other musicians, for pushing them past their comfort zones. It was how he decided who was worthy of his respect. "I mean," Prince continued, adjusting the Stratocaster on his shoulder, "everyone says you're a guitar god. Revolutionary technique. Changed rock and roll forever. All that." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I've been listening to your records, and I have to ask, can you actually play music, or do you just make noise?" Eddie felt the question hit him like a physical blow. It was the same question that had been eating at him for months, the same doubt that woke him up at 3 a.m. when the house in Coldwater Canyon was too quiet and Valerie was sleeping beside him, peaceful and unaware of the storm in his head. The doubt had started with his father, John Van Halen, who'd immigrated from Holland with dreams of his sons becoming classical musicians. John had forced Eddie to learn piano first, spending countless hours drilling scales and Bach inventions into his small fingers. Then came the classical guitar lessons, where John would sit rigid-backed in a wooden chair, counting time with his foot, correcting every minor imperfection with the patience of a metronome and the warmth of a drill sergeant. When Eddie discovered rock and roll, John's disappointment was profound and lasting. "Edward," he'd say in his thick Dutch accent, "that is not real music. Real music requires discipline, study, composition. What you do is noise." The word noise always came with a particular disdain, as if Eddie was personally responsible for corrupting centuries of musical tradition. John had died in 1986, and Eddie had never gotten the chance to prove to him that rock and roll could be real music too. Now Prince was asking the same question in front of 43 people who would talk about this moment for the rest of their careers. "What did you have in mind?" Eddie asked. Prince gestured toward a Takamine acoustic guitar sitting on a stand near the piano. "Something real. No effects pedals. No Marshall stacks. No tapping tricks or whammy bar gymnastics. Just you, 6 strings, and actual musicianship." Eddie looked at the acoustic guitar like it was a loaded weapon. He hadn't played classical pieces in public since he was 15 years old, since his father had finally given up on turning him into a legitimate musician and accepted that his son was going to waste his talent on what Jan called circus music. "I don't really do acoustic," Eddie said. "That's what I figured," Prince replied, that smile getting sharper. "See, the thing about real musicians is they can play anything. Piano, guitar, bass, drums. They can compose, arrange, produce. They understand music theory, harmonic structure, the architecture of a song." He strummed a complex jazz chord on the Stratocaster. "They're not just one-trick ponies with loud amplifiers." Eddie felt his face burning. Everyone in the room was staring at him now. He could see pity in some eyes, curiosity in others. A few people looked uncomfortable, like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. But there was something else building in Eddie's chest. Anger, yes, but also recognition. Prince wasn't just challenging his technique. He was questioning his legitimacy as a musician, the same way his father had questioned it, the same way David Lee Roth had questioned it when he'd accused Eddie of hiding behind guitar solos instead of writing real songs. Eddie stood up and walked toward the acoustic guitar. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hoped nobody noticed. He picked up the Takamine, testing its weight, adjusting the strap. The room was completely silent. "What would you like me to play?" Eddie asked. Prince leaned back against the piano, looking satisfied. "Whatever you want. Something that shows me you're more than just a rock and roll circus act." Eddie closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to Pasadena, to the small house where he'd grown up, to the hours he'd spent practicing classical pieces on a nylon string guitar, while his father sat in the next room, listening and occasionally nodding approval. There was one piece in particular, a Bach invention that Jan had taught him when Eddie was 12. It required precise finger-picking, independent movement of all 4 fingers, the kind of technical control that took years to develop. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell his mother's coffee brewing in the kitchen, could almost hear the sound of his father's clarinet practice drifting from the bedroom. Those were the only times Jan had ever looked at Eddie with something approaching pride, when his son's fingers danced across classical compositions with the precision of a master craftsman. Eddie opened his eyes and began to play. The first notes emerged clean and clear from the acoustic guitar's body. Bach's invention, number 4 in D minor, a piece written for keyboard but adapted for guitar by masters like Andrei Segovia. Eddie's fingers moved across the strings with muscle memory precision, each note articulated perfectly, the 2 independent melodic lines weaving around each other like dancers who'd been partners for centuries. The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Conversations that had been murmuring in the background stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the studio's ambient hum seemed to quiet in deference to the crystalline notes flowing from Eddie's fingertips. Prince's expression changed immediately. The smug confidence disappeared, replaced by something that looked like surprise, then respect, then something deeper. He was hearing something he hadn't expected, something that revealed layers of Eddie Van Halen that the rock world had never seen. But Eddie wasn't playing for Prince anymore. He was playing for his father, for the man who died believing his son had wasted a gift. Each note was an apology, an explanation, a plea for understanding. The piece built in complexity, Eddie's right hand executing the intricate finger-picking pattern that made the single guitar sound like a small orchestra, his left hand finding the precise fret positions that turned mechanical precision into musical poetry. And then something broke inside him. Maybe it was the combination of exhaustion and grief and 3 months of uncertainty about his future. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent trying to prove he was more than just noise. But as Eddie played the final section of the Bach piece, tears started streaming down his face. He didn't stop playing. The tears fell onto the guitar's body, but his fingers never missed a note. never wavered in their precision. The room watched in absolute silence as one of rock and roll's greatest guitarists played classical music and wept, pouring 20 years of father-son conflict and artistic insecurity into a 300-year-old composition. When the last note faded, nobody moved. Prince stood frozen against the piano, his mouth slightly open. Valerie Bertinelli, who had been sitting near the door, stood up and walked toward her husband, but stopped halfway, understanding that this moment belonged to Eddie alone. Eddie set the guitar down gently and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. When he looked up, Prince was staring at him with an expression Eddie had never seen before on another musician's face. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was recognition. The recognition of one artist by another, the acknowledgement that they'd just witnessed something real and rare and honest. Prince walked over to Eddie and extended his hand. When Eddie shook it, Prince leaned in close enough that only Eddie could hear what he said next. "I'm sorry, man. I was testing you, but I didn't mean to hurt you. What you just did, that wasn't noise. That was beautiful." Eddie nodded, not trusting his voice yet. His throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming rather than playing. The emotional release had left him feeling both empty and full, exhausted and energized. Prince turned to address the room, but his voice had lost all trace of its earlier smugness. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was a master class in musicianship. What Eddie just played required 15 years minimum of serious classical training. The technical control, the musical understanding, the emotional depth, that's not something you learn from rock and roll magazines." He looked back at Eddie, and in that moment, the two musicians recognized something in each other that went beyond genre or fame or commercial success. They saw the hours of practice, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of perfection that defined true artistry. He looked back at Eddie. "I came here tonight thinking I knew who you were, the tapping guy, the whammy bar guy, the rock star with the fast fingers. But you're something else entirely, aren't you? You're a real musician who happens to play rock and roll." Eddie found his voice finally. "My father wanted me to be a classical guitarist. He never understood why I chose rock. He died thinking I'd wasted my talent." Prince was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father was wrong about one thing, but right about another. He was wrong to think rock and roll can't be real music, but he was right about you having serious talent. What you just did proves that everything you've accomplished in rock comes from a foundation of genuine musicianship." The room remained silent, understanding they'd witnessed something significant, not just a performance, but a revelation. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a rock guitarist with flashy technique. He was a complete musician who'd chosen to express his artistry through amplifiers and distortion instead of concert halls and classical repertoire. Over the following weeks, word of that night spread through the music industry. The story evolved in the telling, but the core remained consistent. Prince had challenged Eddie Van Halen to prove his legitimacy, and Eddie had responded by playing classical guitar with such skill and emotion that it redefined how people understood his artistry. For Eddie, the night marked a turning point. The doubt that had plagued him since his father's death, the question of whether he was a real musician or just a lucky showman, finally had an answer. Prince Rogers Nelson, one of the most demanding and accomplished musicians of their generation, had looked him in the eye and called him a master. The recording of that performance was never officially released, but bootleg copies circulated among musicians and industry insiders for decades. It became legendary not for its technical perfection, but for its emotional honesty. Here was Eddie Van Halen completely vulnerable, playing not for an audience, but for the ghost of his father, proving once and for all that the foundation beneath all his rock and roll innovations was solid, classical, and real. The tape became a rite of passage among serious guitarists. Young musicians would gather in record shops and private studios to listen to those 5 minutes of raw vulnerability, hearing something that transcended technique or genre. They heard a master craftsman stripped of all pretense, communicating directly through the ancient language of melody and harmony. Years later, when journalists asked Prince about that night, he always said the same thing. "Eddie taught me something important. True artistry isn't about the genre you choose or the instrument you play. It's about the depth of feeling you can express through your chosen medium. That night, Eddie Van Halen expressed more truth in 5 minutes of classical guitar than most musicians manage in entire careers. And Eddie, when asked about the challenge that broke him down and built him back up, would smile and say, "Prince did me a favor. He forced me to remember who I really was underneath all the noise and lights and expectations." Sometimes you need someone to dare you to be honest, even when honesty hurts. That night, I stopped being afraid of my father's ghost and started honoring his memory. The acoustic guitar Eddie played that night was later donated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where it sits with a simple placard. The instrument that proved rock stars can be real musicians too.